I'm Yvette Benavides, and this is The Lonely Voice with Peter Orner on Book Public from Texas Public Radio. We're starting a limited series this week on the stories of Juan Rulfo. On this episode, we'll discuss You Don't Hear Dogs Barking. What eclipses the rereading of any work by Juan Rulfo is the irremediable problem of just how finite are his works. He published 2 books over a span of 2 years. He's well known for his seminal novel Pedro Páramo, which was published in 1955. But perhaps just as important is his 1953 short story collection El Llano en Llamas. At the time, readers in Mexico and throughout Latin America clamored for more books from Juan Rulfo, more of these stories distilled and minimal in narrative technique about rural people at the vexing intersections of human reality. Rulfo said often that his stories came from his tío Celerino, an uncle who drank too much and went from town to town confirming children and bestowing God's blessings on them, even though he charged a fee for his services and was also a reputed atheist. But in storytelling, according to his nephew, he had no equal. Rulfo claims he ran out of stories to tell when this favorite uncle died. In his essay on the Beauty of Not Writing, or an unnecessary homage to Juan Rulfo, Peter Orner writes that a writer's silence, or anybody's, should never be interrogated, only respected, and this from a distance. I've often thought that Peter Orner was a writer's writer, but also a writer for not just readers, but rereaders, those who can return to a work again and again, perhaps in the way that Gabriel Garcia Marquez did, claiming that he memorized every word of Rulfo's Pedro Páramo. Writes Orner, I've come to believe, as often as not, it's not the telling, it's the repeating that is at the core of storytelling. One day, while sitting at a picnic table in Pescadero, California, Peter Orner watched as a Russian family boisterously swapped stories, or seemed to from Orner's vantage point, the scene a strong counterpoint to the austere prose of Juan Rulfo. However, it also occurred to him that this would have been a context that Rulfo would have enjoyed, observing life as it happened around him and gleaning stories about people in all their wondrous complexity. In the story No oyes ladrar a los perros, or You Don't Hear Dogs Barking, we find a story perhaps as easy to reread and even commit to memory as a sonnet because it's distilled to the most essential dialogue and the thinnest exposition. We find a situation that is as wholly unlikely as it is perfectly believable. A father is carrying on his back his injured grown son. They've walked for hours, and the father won't stop until they reach the next town, a place where they hope to find help for Ignacio. We enter the story in medias res, thrust into an already critical life and death situation. What wouldn't a father do for his son in such dire straits? And then, how is he weighed down by the visceral tonnage of an array of emotions, especially as we'll see, the amalgam of disappointment, frustration, fear, and anger that the father shoulders on the journey? There are some things we cannot change about ourselves or about each other, when this fact also means that there are things we cannot change about our children. The failures seem even more impossible to bear. And in the books left to us by Juan Rulfo, he reminds us of this fact, that there is very little to say, but it must be said. Orner wonders if it's ever a good idea to channel a hero, to immerse ourselves in the rhythms and cadences and textures of a life in rural Mexico, to understand ourselves any place in the world, even on a picnic bench in Northern California. For Orner, the key to understanding Rulfo's universal appeal is not to focus on what Rulfo says in his stories, but instead to concentrate squarely on the silences. And what of Ignacio and his father? Our defeats are our stories, Peter Orner reminds us. Stories have got to be told. I say, tell them. Tell them sparingly if you can, but tell them. Here's our discussion of You Don't Hear Dogs Barking by Juan Rulfo. If somebody makes this kind of hyperbolic statement about a short story, we've got to be able to say, what's so great about it, really? What is it? Somehow his stories are so perfect. So what is it, just in a general way, what is it for you before we take it apart?
Well, here's what somebody else said about how great it is. This is Raul Zurita, a poet, wonderful poet who edited, along with Forrest Gander, a anthology called Pinholes in the Night, which is essential poems from Latin America. And in this book of poems, with Cesar Vallejo and Pablo Neruda, Jaime Sabines, the great Mexican poet, he includes this story. You Don't Hear Dogs Barking appears among the stories of The Plain in Flames, and again, that title, which is sometimes translated as The Burning Plain. He says, the story is a masterpiece far beyond the compartmentalizing literary jockeying that makes its author, Juan Rulfo, Mexico's matchless poet and one of contemporary literature's best. And then he goes on to say something similar about You Don't Hear Dogs Barking, claiming it's a poem without redemption, its journey, the anticipation of a defeat as universal as it is intimate. Few images, and here we go. Here, talk about hyperbole, right? Few images in the history of art and literature, Zurita says, match that of the old man carrying his dying son on his shoulders through the night. What this parable of defeat shows us is that the history of language, those 150,000 years during which we've crisscrossed the earth exchanging grimaces, grunts, and words, is also a fable of misunderstanding. And then he quotes the story. And you didn't hear them, Ignacio. You didn't help me even with that hope. People take this story to extremes, and so we're not alone in this, and from my point of view, and Zurita gets to it. It's the basicness of it. You have an old man carrying his son, his injured son. He's been injured in some fight, seriously injured, and he's carrying him to another town across the desert for hours. The story is 5 pages?
Yes.
If that, 4.5.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. No, not a whole lot of context. We know his son's kind of a bandit. He's a bad guy. And that's about it, right, in terms of any backstory, which we'll get to. But I guess for me, it's just how truly elemental it is. And why does that make it a great story? It's hard to say, and hopefully we'll get to why. But I'll say one more thing. It's the physicality of it. Literally, you read this story and you feel what it's like to be an old man with your grown son on your back. And I just, as a tiny aside, this past weekend, I took my 4-year-old on a 4-mile hike, right? And I had him in one of those. He's a little old for this, but I had him in the backpack, and I was exhausted after a mile. And he's 4, and I was kept thinking about this story. I'm like, this is right. And so in extreme conditions, human beings do extraordinary things. We know this, strength-wise. But what this old man does in this story is almost beyond physical belief for me.
That is so powerful to think about, right? It's like when we talk about fathers and their sons, let's say, or of whatever discord and how it weighs physically emotionally, sure, but how the burden also is so heavy, so palpably heavy, but not like this, not like actually shouldering a grown man and carrying him for hours. Yeah, it defies all believability. And yet, there we are for paragraph after paragraph and page after page of it, basically feeling the weight of it, I think.
And it's not fantastical, right? I mean, Rulfo knows that if the story is going to resonate, if the story is going to work at all, then we've got to believe it. And I think, there's so many places that I could point to, but the one that I think of is when, the son keeps wanting him to put him down, right? And he this is on page 2. The old man backed up to a thick wall and bent over without letting his load down from his shoulders. Though his legs were buckling, he didn't want to sit, because then he wouldn't have been able to lift his son's body again. They had helped him put him on his back a while ago, hours before, and he'd been carrying him all the way since then. So he backs up to a rock wall to rest a little, but he doesn't put him down. We all know what that's like, right? You put something down, it's over. So Rulfo knows that if the old man puts the kid down, and he's not a kid, he's a grown man, puts a man down, and there's a moment where he actually calls him a man, one moment towards the end, which just slays me. Suddenly he goes from being Ignacio to the man. But Rulfo knows that this is all about the physicality of it. And, for a story, again, that's so tiny, to have this kind of power, I think it comes from moments like that, when he decides, he can rest a tiny, tiny bit here, but he can't possibly let him down, or else he'll never get him back up on his back and shoulders again, and that'll be it.
Right. He had help. Somebody helped him.
Right.
And
another story writer would be like telling that story of who helped him. They helped. That's all we get.
Yeah.
They, who's they? When? What happened? What did Ignacio do? No idea, except he was doing something bad with his friends, who apparently are all dead.
Can't you just see the marginalia from a creative writing instructor? Who is they? And just ruining everything.
Right. That's why you can't mess with this stuff. And I could be sitting in a class and do that very same thing. You know what I mean? And so you got to be careful when you're faced with a piece of art.
Yeah. He is bound and determined himself to get to Tonaya. And there does seem to be an ulterior motive beyond the idea of getting help for him. It is sort of like, I am your father. I promised your mother I'm going to do this. It's such a complicated journey for that reason too. It's like, yes, he has to get help for his son in the next town, but there's a little bit more writing on it for the father.
Wow, Yvette, you're really getting. Because the story, like, people might listen and say, "Oh, what a beautiful story." It's about a father, rescuing his son and carrying him across the desert to the next town to see a doctor. You know what I mean? Let's start the violins going, right? And yet, Rulfo's not interested, even though that is, love for a son is certainly there. It's there, but it's not going to be, it's not going to be handed to us like that.
No,
right?
No. And so it's even more burdensome.
Yeah, because he berates him.
Yeah.
But before we get there, because it's almost like one of these stories that I wanted to last longer.
Mm-hmm.
But I read it and it's over.
I know.
It's over. But I want to talk about the beginning.
Okay.
I want to talk about how it starts, because it's and people who are familiar with the Plane in Flames or the Burning Plain know that that you're getting these compressed, stories that, I think you could say, start in motion, start in media res, right? They are just there. And the first few lines of this story are extraordinary, and they go like this. You up there, Ignacio, tell me if you hear some sign or see some light somewhere. I don't see anything. We must be close. Yes, but I can't hear a thing. Look hard. I don't see anything. So much the worse for you, Ignacio. So there's all of the dialogue. That's how it begins. Before we have any notion of what's going on, but tell me, Ignacio, what do you see up there? So you get a notion of maybe what somebody must be carrying someone, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But I suppose Ignacio could be at the top of a tower, and the guy could be down below. What do you see up there, right? So we still don't know. And then there's this. The men's long, dark shadow continued moving up and down, climbing over the rocks, getting smaller and larger as it went along the edge of the arroyo. It was a single shadow reeling.
That's the first punch in the stomach, is the single shadow.
Yeah. And I would also say just that word continued. The men's long, dark shadow continued. So we are in motion, and we have been out in this desert for hours before the story comes into play. And just think about the choice there of what Rulfo, instead of, there's a whole story. You could tell a novel about Ignacio and how he turned bad, and his father apparently, rescuing him after he's been beaten up or shot or whatever he's been, right?
Mm-hmm.
But Rulfo picks it up long into the journey to the town or the village, depending on the translation.
But if back to this idea of starting the story with dialogue and not providing any context, there too again, the writing instructor's red pen immediately goes there. Where are we? And thank God that didn't happen to Rulfo. But yeah, it's and also I want to point to this. Tell me if you hear some sign or see some light. That's in the first sentence. And the response is, I don't see anything. I can't hear a thing. I don't see anything. I mean, it's like from the beginning, the son's response is 0.
Yeah, because at this point, he's been up there, he's injured, he's riding, there's a description of his hands pressing into his father's head to hold on,
Mm-hmm.
And he, he's fading, he's dying, he's injured,
Mm-hmm.
and so of course it's long past the point of Ignacio looking around, and it starts there, as opposed to emerges there. So you said before we started the call today, like what an unremittingly sad story this is. I mean, it is. It's devastating, and it starts that way. It doesn't evolve necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it gets worse, but it starts, and we're in really bad shape. We got an old man who can barely make it, and we got a son who's dying on his back.
Yeah. And he says, how do you feel? Bad. Bad. So, and his insistence of put me down, leave me here, you go on. And the father says no.
Yeah.
And the father is walking blind at this point. He can't really see what's up ahead.
No.
And so I don't know if I want to go there to this idea of an implicit trust that he feels. I don't think it's that. I think that's almost too poetic. I think it's just, this is what a father has to do. Keep going.
Yeah, and I would push back a little. I think implicit trust is really what is happening in spite of all the bad blood between them, which doesn't really emerge until later in the story, but it's certainly present all along. And yet, they're father and son. And so, he can't see. He's sort of staggering through the desert. And you mentioned the line of dialogue, "How do you feel?" Bad, which is just so brilliant that he would just do that so starkly. But the next paragraph, to me, is just astounding. He said little, less and less. At times he looked asleep. At times he looked to be cold. Now, you just said that the father was blind. And even if he wasn't blind, he wouldn't be able to see how his son looks. And I find the narration just fascinating here. At times he looked asleep. At times he looked to be cold. He trembled. And then he knew when the tremors were taking over his son because of his shaking and because his feet would dig into his father's flanks like spurs. So there is the feeling where that the father could experience, because he can feel his son shake, and he can feel his son's feet digging into his flanks like spurs. But it's this, I find it so almost heartbreakingly beautiful that the narrator here kind of enters the story very subtly. At times he looked asleep. At times he looked to be cold. I think a translator must be having a nightmare here to figure out how to handle this. And I actually looked at the Spanish. It does seem that is what is happening. That the narrator is sort of breaking in slightly there, but it's so delicate, and people might not necessarily even notice it. I certainly didn't the first 20 times I read this story. But there's a narrator here.
Yeah. So because as the son has the opportunity, but not the strength, not the physical strength, to look out toward the horizon, toward what's in front of him, the father can really only look down, probably. And it's like we understand that the son feels bad and is in a lot of pain, probably. But the father, I feel like in those moments where the son hangs on all the more to his head, or digs his feet into his father's flanks like spurs, I think he makes the journey even harder for the father as they go. So the father's looking down, or you really can't see too far ahead, and all they have is the moon to light the way. It's made much worse as we go for the father. Certainly the son is dying, of course, but it feels like through some osmotic process, the father is feeling worse as they go through the journey.
Yeah, and again, it comes down to the physicality of the story. Naturally, I mean, he can't move forward as well as he could earlier on in this journey, and that's where Rulfo picks them up at the moment where they're barely making it, but they are making it, which is why the story isn't as bleak as it might seem. I mean, it's not that it has a happy ending, far from it, but they do reach the village, and that's an incredible endurance test that this father experiences. But as you say, that the son isn't making it easier, but that's because he's just trying to hang on. He's trying to hang on. But I mean, like, imagine like if you were the son, and you really didn't want this to go on anymore. Couldn't you fall off? I mean, couldn't you just enough let go? Let go. Right? If you don't want to be carried, unless you're unconscious, you can prevent being carried. You could kick them in the head, right? You could do a lot of things, even if you're barely alive. So it seems like you're exactly what you said. It's like the son isn't making it easier, but he's also like still, part of him is still hanging on.
Yeah, because he could just slide off. The father's not holding him there. He's holding his father's head, and he's holding on with his feet. It seems desperate. I mean, it seems like he is desperately holding on, even as much as he says, "Put me down." And then he says it again, put me down, Father. Do you feel bad? Yes. I'll get you to Tonaya no matter what. I've carried you for hours and won't drop you here so whoever is after you can finish you off.
And as the story moves on, a strange thing happens. And I can understand this in a physical level too. And there's so much to talk about in the story, just to context and why these stories sort of, lit the Mexican literary world on fire and all of that. But staying inside the story, which is where we belong, right? Mm-hmm. It seems what's extraordinary that starts to happen is the father becomes more loquacious as the story moves on. He wants to talk more. He has the strength not only to stagger across the desert, because basically he thinks the town must be in sight. I mean, it must be just around the next, up and over the next hill. He starts talking a lot more. He starts telling the son things that aren't helpful, which make the story so brilliant for me.
And what is that about, do you think?
I mean, I think there's where the story is. There's the physicality of a father carrying his son on his back and shoulders across the desert. But it's also that, and I've been thinking a lot about this, he's got a captive audience. This son has been a bandit, a ne'er-do-well, a robber, whatever he's been up to. He's been up to a lot of stuff, and this gets to the context of like what's going on in Mexico and at this time, and there's a lot of upheaval, right? Mm-hmm. And this kid is, who knows what he's caught up in, but he's doing things that his parents obviously disapprove of, including robbing, like his godfather, apparently. He's a bad guy, and the father takes this opportunity while he is saving his life, or at least desperately trying to save his life. He takes the opportunity to tell the son what he thinks of him, and that is a long paragraph of dialogue in a story that didn't have that kind of conversation before.
It is an opportunity for him not to settle any kind of score, but to say the things maybe he's always wanted to say to him. Everything I'm doing, I'm not doing for you, I'm doing it for your late mother, right? It's like, now's his chance. You're right. It's his captive audience. You're right. It's like, now is his chance to say these things. These are not the things we say to our children just as a matter of routine.
And he hasn't had the chance. His son probably hasn't given him any chance. When you're robbing people, it's not like you want to hear about how bad you are from your dad, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, probably Ignacio has had nothing to do with his father. Again, we have no idea because Rulfo gives us none of that backstory. But I can say with great assurance that these guys have not talked in a while, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And then there's that paragraph that you point to. Everything I'm doing, I'm not doing for you. Don't get readers, don't get sentimental here, right? Mm-hmm. Even though I think there is an amount of sentimentality in this story, and not of a cheap kind, but actually, I mean, there's a great deal of, the endurance of love in this story for sure, right? Mm-hmm. But he lets him have it. She would reproach me if I'd left you lying there where I found you and had not picked you up and carried you to where they can take care of you, like I'm doing. It's she who gives me courage, not you. Starting with the fact that I owe you nothing but difficulty, nothing but humiliation, nothing but shame. He owes the kid humiliation. That's pretty awesome. I haven't seen that before. I owe you humiliation. And again, I thank the translator for that one. Mm-hmm. But I think it's there in the original.
But then the very next thing is, I'll break my back, but I'll go to Tonaya with you.
Except what's between that? There's this description which is so can I read it?
Yes. Yes.
And I don't mean to. He sweat as he spoke, but the night wind dried the sweat, and so he sweated again over the dried sweat. That's what comes in the middle. Rulfo never forgets the physicality of this, and even if it's just a tiny line. But how many times I've never read a line where it talks about dried sweat, new sweat drying over the previously dried sweat. Have you?
No. And
how many times have you experienced that?
Yes. But it is, I do and I do and I do for you, and I get no thanks. And so then that dries up and then there's more, right? It's like, it's just like endlessly giving over to the sun.
And then there's probably the longest paragraph in the story.
Yep. Do you want to read that?
Why don't you read that?
I'll break my back, but I'll get to Tonaya with you so the injuries they've inflicted on you can be healed. Although I'm sure that once you're well, you'll return to your evil ways. That doesn't matter to me anymore. As long as you go far away where I no longer hear anything about you. As long as that happens, because to me, you're no longer my son. I've cursed the blood you have from me. The part you got from me I've cursed. I've said, let the blood I gave him rot in his kidneys. I said it from the moment I knew you had taken to the road, robbing to make a living and killing people, and good people. And not only that, there's my compadre Tranquilino, the man who baptized you, who gave you your name. He had the ill luck to run into you too. From that time on, I said, this can't be my son.
It's like a total destruction of this guy. Not only are you a horrible, horrible guy, but you've also, look what you did to my compadre Tranquilino, which translates as what? Tranquil?
Yeah.
Completely the worst of the worst, right? So there's no redemption for this guy, except, again, I guess all bets are off in terms of the anti-hyperbole rule, which I swear will come back after this episode. But to me, and this is just something that kind of came to me recently, but the move that Rulfo makes in the next paragraph from this one is just like, I don't know what the right metaphor would be. Like, kind of you're on a trapeze artist and you're the most difficult artistic maneuver. Imagine that, I think, is what happens here on the next. From that paragraph that you just read, the complete indictment to this. Look and see if you can see anything. Or if you hear anything, you can do it from up there because I'm feeling deaf. Suddenly, he goes from that complete indictment to, what do you see? Mm-hmm. It gets a totally different register, almost a different voice, almost a different relationship, right? Mm-hmm. And it slaughters me. Mm-hmm. Without introduction, without the kind of no contextual, like, he adjusted his shoulder or something like that. Mm-hmm. It's a new paragraph with a new line of dialogue that comes from the same character, mm-hmm. which you mentioned, creative writing teachers, of which sometimes I sadly am, would say, like, well, I don't know, I don't know who's speaking here. It's the same character? Why don't you have some distinguishing thing to make us clear that the same character is speaking twice? It is the same character, but it's a different character in a way. It's a different father who asks him, hey, what do you see now? You're the worst person ever, 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 ever. What do you see now? And it's so subtle. Rulfo is the least show-offy writer. He's the least show-offy great writer you can find. And that maneuver right there is, you could go a long time without seeing something quite like that, where what would it have taken for him to have something in the middle of that, to say, like, and then something else, you know what I mean? Something made him, he stumbled, and then he said, what do you see? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It just took incredible discipline to not kind of fill in that space. And I checked the Spanish, and the dialogue follows right on each other, right? Mm-hmm. So it's the one line of dialogue, the big chunk of dialogue, and then the tiny one.
The very next beat is, for me, pretty devastating, because then he says, I'm thirsty. And I remember reading that recently, after not having read the story in such a long time, and having this heart-sinking feeling of, oh no. It's like it's everything else. The father's carrying him. It's this, this indictment, and what else heartbreaking can happen?
Mm-hmm.
And it's this. I'm thirsty.
Yeah. And the father says, live with it. Live with it. We must be close. It's already very late. They must have turned the lights off in the village. But at least you should hear if the dogs are barking. Try to hear. And the son's like, I'm done with this. I'm done with this, Dad. Give me water. There's no water. There's nothing but rocks. But he's still going. He's still going.
And then there's the next long paragraph.
Yeah. Like, why does the father keep giving these speeches? And I think one way of seeing it is, like we talked about, that he has a chance to be alone with his kid for the first time in a long time, so he's taking advantage of it. Mm-hmm. The other thing is I think it's actually giving him strength to speak like this.
Because I was thinking, oh, it must just totally wipe him out to have to open his mouth and talk and say anything. And so the opposite is what you're offering. I think that's powerful.
I mean, I think it's possible that, mm-hmm. that you reach a certain point where you have to give yourself the anger, almost the rage, kind of keeps him going.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I don't know how physically he's able to do this at all. Period.
Mm-hmm.
So, maybe he is making. I mean, obviously, if he's talking, he's taking energy. It's making it harder for sure. But I remember when you were born. That's how you were then. You would wake up hungry and would eat before you went back to sleep, and your mother would give you water because you had already gone through her milk. You wouldn't be full, and you'd get mad. I never thought that as time went by that madness would go to your head, but that's what happened. Your mother, may she rest in peace, wanted you to grow up strong. She thought that when you'd grow up, you would look after her. You were all she had. The other child she was going to have killed her, and you would have killed her again if she were alive at this point. So, again, it's like, I mean, you just want to, say, can you just give the kid a break so you can get to the hospital? But no.
And then the next line, there's that reference to the man. He felt the man.
Yeah. Which, you could go through and almost every paragraph could be like, oh my God, it's the greatest thing ever. But this,
yeah.
He felt the man he was carrying on his shoulder stop pressing inward with his knees and let his feet go. They were swinging from one side to the other, and he felt the head up above shake as if it were sobbing. So he got to him. It's beyond the pain, the physical pain. He actually got to the kid. The speeches worked, in a sense. He got to him. He got to the kid emotionally, the son. We're in the desert, and we're struggling to just make it. All we want to do is make it, but they've got almost bigger things to deal with than the survival of the moment, in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, I don't think it's a totally bleak story. I think it's a story about a connection. He makes the connection. He tells the kid, look what you have done. Now do you get it? That's better than him having died without that. I'm not saying it's happy. It's not.
But it does seem he couldn't have made the connection otherwise, except in a moment like that.
No. Do you think?
Mm-mm.
Come on, son, let's go have a beer and talk about how horrible how horrible you've been and what you've done to your mother's memory,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Here it's this is the ultimate father-son conversation. While at the same time he's saving his life, or trying to, desperately trying to save his life. If he truly felt the way he's talking about, he'd drop the kid in the desert. So it can be both. I don't think the rage is hate. I think the rage is love.
Mm-hmm.
In a sense, I think the silence honors a story. I always feel like, oh my God, we're on the radio, we have to talk, But like, I think Rulfo would be like, all right, shut up already, just let the story be. You know what I mean? But there's more. It's not over. It's not over. It's not even over. Are you crying, Ignacio? The memory of your mother is making you cry, right? But you never did anything for her. You always repaid us badly. Like, he's still going. It seems as if instead of affection, we had filled your body with malice. And now you see, they've wounded you. What happened to your friends? Did they kill them all? But they had no one. And that's, I mean, again, like, he doesn't blare the horn when he's making his enormous fictional points, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I learned from Rulfo is, you blow the horn, and almost like what we're doing now is it's like anti-fiction. You know what I mean? By sort of pointing out stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Because buried in that paragraph is, but they had no one. But they had no one. You got me. I picked you up, and I'm taking you to this next town. And you wonder, like, why wasn't there a doctor in the town he got injured in or beat up in? Why does he have to go to this other town? Well, because maybe nobody would have helped him in that town because they all know what a jerk he is. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Because at a certain point, Rulfo isn't real. There's a certain point where it becomes mythical.
So we have no one to give our sorrows to, the friends would say. But you, Ignacio?
Yeah.
So that's the second to the last thing he says.
Yeah. And Rulfo shifts to and we're going to talk more about him, is what I think about with him is how he's able to give me the visual picture in my head with so few words. So few words. I'm seeing the vastness of this desert. I'm seeing how difficult this is. I'm seeing the rock that he rested against, in that one moment where he wouldn't put his kid down because if he had, he wouldn't have been able to pick him up again. And then at the very end of the story, he gives us this sort of, this description. At last, the village was there. He saw the roofs shining under the moonlight. I think we should say it's dark. It's gotten dark at this point.
Mm-hmm.
It's been dark, actually, I think the whole time. Sometimes I visualize the story in daylight, but it's not daylight, right?
Right. I know. Sometimes I do too, like with the sun beating down on them.
Yeah. As if it wasn't bad enough,
Mm-hmm.
But there's moon on the first page.
Yeah. So, with difficulty, he unclenched the fingers with which his son had been clinging to his neck.
Yeah.
And once free, he heard the dogs barking everywhere. And what about the last line, Peter?
It just that unclenched the fingers. We haven't talked about that. For a long time, for many years, there was only one English translation, and it wasn't this one.
Mm-hmm.
It was a different translation. The title of this book is The Plain in Flames, and the title of the old translation is The Burning Plain. And in that, I don't have it opened but in front of me, but the translator chooses a different word, not unclenched. He says unpried, which is interesting. But the point is how do you read that? If you have to unclench someone's fingers, that's not a good sign, right?
Mm-hmm.
With which his son had been clinging. But he doesn't tell us that the son has died. And I don't know if the son has or not, but I know things aren't good.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think if you have to unclench somebody's fingers, I think I would err on the side of his not having made it. And then the last line, and you didn't hear them, Ignacio? He said, you didn't help me even with that hope? Like, what's he talking about? Hear who? Hear what? What are your thoughts about that last line?
Well, the ambiguity of, is he dead, is he not dead, even though his body is limp, as if
Yeah.
its joints had been removed. I feel like the last line of dialogue is sort of saying, it seems so final. You can either take it as like he's continuing with one of these diatribes where he's just ranting at the sun, or he says you didn't hear them. So the idea of you didn't hear them because you really couldn't hear them, right? He was dead, and you didn't even give me sort of that last bit of esperanza, of hope. So I feel like it's really about you. I always think about it in terms of you, not that he didn't hear a word he said this whole time, but that he did hear him, and it's too late.
I think that too. I think, I mean, so the story's bleak. It's despairing. But again, I come back to the fact that maybe it was a one-sided conversation, but it was certainly a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
There's that, but it's but Rulfo is not screwing around. He's not going to give anybody false hopes. But what he does do is show what these characters are capable of, not just physically, but psychologically. To be able to have done this, to be able to have endured that, and I don't think that is, I think that's huge, and I think it's, I don't know, maybe this word's sort of overused with Rulfo, I've seen, but the dignity that he endows his characters.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd say right here there's incredible dignity for this man, dignity and honor, and also cruelty. There's no question about it. But he's diatribing against his son, while at the same time struggling across the sand. It's just a story to reread,
So I'm thinking about it in terms of when my students ask me if is everything we read going to be sad? Does everything we read have to be sad? And that's missing a much finer point. I think sometimes they want to brace themselves against a moral or a takeaway or this kind of, what did you learn from the story? How did the character change for the better? Well, in short stories, as in life, sometimes it's not about a takeaway. It's not about a tidy ending, and the character learns something and moves forward. It's just not. It's not going to be that way. And I feel like it's not just bleak for this emo thing. It's not bleak just for the sake of being sad. It's very real in this way that I feel like there's like, if we're going to learn something, and I'm thinking about an interview that you gave. I watched the video of it where you said to somebody, I can't remember who it was, I don't want to, to figure out the meaning. That's not the idea when we read short stories. It's what does it make you feel, right? How did it restart your heart? This sort of thing. And with this story, I feel like it's something to do with relationships, maybe the familial ones or the parent-child ones, around burdens, that physical weight that we were talking about before, that cannot be changed. I'm thinking also of another, the Richard Bausch essay that you wrote about that story, about the little granddaughter who's jumping rope in the rain. There are some things about our children that we cannot change.
Right.
And when we don't accept that, there are things about our children that we cannot change, no matter what we say or do or think or feel. And that's a very powerful human thing that I think is very hard for parents to say out loud.
Like if there's a way of talking about why this story is so great. You just did it. You know what I mean? I mean, there it is. It's, this idea of parents not being able to, we can't determine everything that happens, and we can't change stuff. And so then what? Then what? And maybe this is an extreme example of what parents have to do or do, but maybe the world needs, and I think the idea is that this is one of the supreme examples of what parents have to do.
Juan Rulfo is the author of No oyes ladrar a los perros, from El Llano en Llamas. We've discussed here You Don't Hear the Dogs Barking, the translation by Ilan Stavans and Harold Augengram from the book The Plain in Flames, published by the University of Texas Press. The story No Dogs Bark appears in The Burning Plain and Other Stories, translated by George Shade and published by the University of Texas Press. The essays referenced here by Peter Orner come from the book Am I Alone Here?, published by Catapult. He's also the author of 5 other books, including Maggie Brown and Others, published by Little Brown and Company. Peter Orner holds the professorship in English and Creative Writing at Dartmouth College. This has been The Lonely Voice with Peter Orner from Book Public. Write to us at bookpublic@tpr.org. Jacob Rosati composed our theme music. Bree Kirkham is our digital producer. Dan Katz is Texas Public Radio's news director. I'm Yvette Benavides.